Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called Jimi Hendrix, the Greatest Rock Star. Okay, so where do we start with this? I wanted to talk about Jimi Hendrix. I've been trying to think of an angle to talk about Jimi Hendrix on this channel, and I haven't been able to think of one. So I thought what I would do is just talk about my me meeting the incredible artistic achievement of Jimi Hendrix for the first time and how that affected me, and then how I see that has affected everybody else. So in 1979 I became very interested in music. I started messing about with a couple of drumsticks, so I was playing a little bit. I was listening to lots of new wave of British heavy metal. That was taking me towards sort of classic bands like Rush and Hendrix and Led Zeppelin. I hadn't even got to those then. I was listening to like Whitesnake, Rainbow, Motorhead, Angel Witch, Diamond Head. This is around about 79, 1980. Before that, I'd been a big fan of chart music, like all kids. I said to my dad that I was into these bands like Whitesnake and Rainbow and Judas Priest. He heard these things and he said, you need to go and check out two artists. And the one he mentioned was King Crimson, which I never got to hear. Didn't know what he was on about. I just remember him mentioning the name. And the other artist he said was Jimi Hendrix. Now, as 1979 drew to a close, they had a documentary which was it was called The First 25 Years of Rock and Roll. And this is really looking at what rock and roll had done up to that point. And I can remember watching that as that decade drew to a close, and on that was some footage of Jimi Hendrix. This stuck out for me as being completely different to all the Bill Haley and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Carpenters and ELO or whatever else they put up as being part of the history of rock and roll. And I think they put up a bit of footage which looking back was probably his guitar solo from Isle of Wight. I think that's what it was. I never heard anything like it in my life. This was the most exciting looking gentleman that I'd ever seen in rock and roll, on stage making sounds that sounded like they came from another planet. Alright? I was really intrigued by this guy, and I could see why my dad had mentioned this guy to me. It was an incredible experience. And so and it took me a couple of years to pluck up the courage to get an album, but eventually I went and got an album by this guy, and it was this one. This is what was in the shop. Special price series, Jimi Hendrix Stone Free. Now this is actually a compilation album, but this album is so important to me. This is the Jimi Hendrix album for me, right? Of course, Jimi Hendrix made quite a few albums. He was only around, making albums for 3-4 years. He made some of the most important albums in the history of rock music. But he made so much material in that period. They were able to release so many compilations albums with new material on and the existing material put together. And I was lucky to buy this album because this album pulled together a whole bunch of tracks that were more on the funkier, jazzy side of what Hendrix did. I'm going to go through the tracks that are on here. It opens up with Stone Free, which is about as funky as it gets. Then you got Crosstown Traffic, Easy Rider. Incredibly funky, fluid, almost like jazz fusion before jazz fusion's come on. You've got the Drifter's Escape on here, which is an incredible track that never gets mentioned. You got the beautiful ballad Angel. That was the first track I ever heard of one of his ballads, that like Castle Maze that stands on Little Wing, which are also both on here. And side one finishes up with Are You Experienced, off the first album, the great psychedelic mind melting track off that album. Side two opens up with All Along the Watchtower. When I heard that and I heard Hendrix's guitar solo, I was blown away by what he was doing. And it was just the changes, the abrupt changes in colours and sounds and approaches, as Hendrix sort of does everything on the guitar. His tone changes, his way of playing changes. Then you've got the live Johnny Be Good, which was taken from one of the live concerts that was filmed. And that was interesting for me because I got it. Here we have Chuck Berry coming out as the great first rock Guitar Hero doing Johnny Be Good, which is about a guitar hero, and then Hendrix does that and basically rewrites the book on that track. You then have the Blues Red House, because Hendrix was a blues player. We got Long Hot Summer Night, another really funky track, and it ends up with Castle Made of Sand and Little Wing, two of his great ballads. Those are my Hendrix tracks. Later on, I managed to get a copy of Axis Boulder's Love. I bought so many of these compilation albums by him, and I started to pick up his tracks, not by the albums, but by these compilations albums. I can remember going around to my friend, and he bought one of these albums, and the opening track on that was Voodoo Child. And I knew Hendrix from, I'd had about 3 or 4 albums, I've never heard Voodoo Child. And he put that on, and again, I was blown away. I was continually blown away by Hendrix as a young lad, absolutely blown away. I think that if when we look at rock music, and we look at the idea of the rock star, or we look at the idea of the guitar hero, or we look at the idea of the progressive rock musician, or the jazz fusion musician, Hendrix is not only one of the first in there doing all that, but he is the greatest as well, right? So on a channel devoted to prog, we don't talk about Hendrix, but Hendrix is one of the first great progressive rock musicians. We never say that. I've just done a top 10 of the greatest progressive rock albums. But is Electric Ladyland a progressive rock album? Is it? Tell me in the comments down below. Is it? Right? Is Voodoo Child a jazz fusion track? Right? Is that modal approach that he takes on Machine Gun, on Band of Gypsies, which is one of my favourite Hendrix albums. I would say the albums personally for me, which just I grew up with, would be a whole bunch of compilations album, but that compilation album and another compilation album called Voodoo Child that I went and grabbed as soon as I'd heard that track, and that got a whole bunch of other tracks. Axis Boulder of Love, which is the only album I ever bought by him. I never had Ivy experience. I've never actually sat and listened to Electric Ladyland all the way through in one go. I've only heard bits here, bits there. I don't own a copy of it. It's something that is a terrible thing, you know, because I'm so influenced by that album. And Band of Gypsies, that was the other album that blew me away, because that was where Hendrix really played the guitar. Hendrix's legacy is something I want to discuss on this video, because I think he is so mighty that he never gets counted in the genres. He's never seen or discussed of in heavy metal, even though he's pioneered that genre. He's never discussed in progressive rock or fusion. He's never discussed in terms of even the only place he probably does get discussed is as a guitar hero, and he is of course seen as the ultimate guitar hero. But even with that, so many people will stand up and go, "Oh, you know, you can't play like Eddie Van Halen, you can't play like Yngwie Malmsteen," you know. Yep, and they can't play like him, because what Hendrix did was something else. If you're listening to him with those ears and wanting to hear like fast guitar, yeah, he could play the guitar fast. He couldn't play the guitar fast like Yngwie Malmsteen. He couldn't tap like Eddie Van Halen. You know, he wasn't a bebopper that could play through chord changes like Joe Pass. You know, he wasn't that, right? Hendrix was something else. What was he? Well, he's a product of his culture. He's a product of somebody who's grown up listening to rhythm and blues and early soul music. Okay, he's a consummate blues player, but he's also grown up seeing those 1950s blues acts where you had to entertain the audience, you know. So he knows how to put on a show. By the early 60s, he's playing with people like Little Richard and Sam and Dave, and he knows how to put on a show. He knows that not only has he got to play the guitar great, but he's got to be able to put the guitar behind his neck and play with his teeth and do all that sort of stuff. That's something that really comes from that Chitlin circuit in America. Of course, rock music, which is the key to this, is being developed in the UK. There's a big stew going on in the 60s you know, with people like John Mayall, Alexis Corner, Graham Bond. There's a whole bunch of musicians in there, like Eric Clapton and Dick Hextall Smith. You've got John McLaughlin's in there. You've got young Jeff Beck's in there. There's a whole bunch of musicians that are really creating a new sound. You know, this really coalesces around Cream, 1965, 1966. But the big secret of that genre is that, and that time, is that at some point Hendrix from America drops right into the middle of it. And what you have with Hendrix is the authentic blues coming in, and that show, being able to put on a show. You drop him into that period of time in London in the mid-60s, right? And the other thing that's happening in the mid-60s is that the British musicians have the Marshall amp. And the Marshall amp is a 100-watt amp, which is big and loud and can be overdriven. And the overdrive sound enables you to sustain notes. This is what Eric Clapton's trying to do. He's trying to sustain notes. He's taking the ideas from musicians he'd grown up with, like Freddie King and Albert Collins and all those musicians, B.B. King, and then he's sustaining notes. And that's really coming from jazz. People want to sound like Coltrane. They want to be able to extend the note out. They're listening to that as well. Believe me, Clapton's listening to that as well in the 60s. And it's creating a hybrid, which is a high volume rhythm and blues based form where people are playing the blues and improvising on the blues, but also trying to emulate the modal forms that are coming out of jazz at that time. And then suddenly the real deal drops into it, right? And Hendrix puts all that together, and he puts that together by able to put on a show as well. He knows how to entertain the audience. Cream come out in 1966, and they really sort of set the bar to how a rock band could improvise, how a trio works, you know, how the guitar, bass and drums, how you utilise the freedom in that. Jack Bruce, you know, brings in a sort of real jazz approach to bass. Ginger Baker brings in a jazz approach to drums, and then you have that blues modal approach that Clapton brings in. That's the blueprint. But Hendrix the guy, and Hendrix puts a band together which has Mitch Mitchell on drums, which is really, as he said, was his Elvin Jones. This is where it's coming from. It's the marriage of modal jazz, free jazz, and the blues, right? This is where rock music's born. A few months later, Hendrix comes out. Just a few months after the first Cream album comes the first Hendrix album. He takes the world by storm, right? If you watch his appearance on Monterey, what did I just say? The Monterey Pop Festival, that footage, right, where he sets fire to his guitar and does all that. That is a show. It's a real show. It's a defining point in rock music in terms of the show, the way Hendrix looks. You know, the fact that Hendrix is one of the first black musicians to not totally be seen as a soul musician. You know, he's not an Otis Redding, right? He's something else, and he's moving into a sort of white mainstream pop music area, and he's able to do that because he can put on a show. He was described at the time as the Black Elvis, which is a stupid term because Elvis was the white version of a million, you know, rhythm and blues singers, you know, or country singers. This. I hate when identity politics tries to put a shape on pop music, rock music, jazz history. It always like skews it off so much, right? But it's very important that Hendrix was one of the first black superstar musicians to cross over into the white mainstream and not be seen as somebody who was just performing a black music form like soul. You know, that's a very important thing. And I think he can do that because of the way he looked and the show. That's all part of the show, what he wore, what he looked like. He had a magnetism, there's a sexuality there. All right, the way he plays the guitar and all the tricks he does is really, really important. I think without that, which Clapton never did, you know, Clapton never did this. Without that, Hendrix wouldn't have been able to take the music so far out. So people perceived what he did on guitar in a different way. If you listen to musically what's going on when Hendrix gets up and does a wild thing at the Monterey Pop Festival, that's avant-garde free jazz, right? Everyone just go, yeah, but it's just noise, isn't it? No, because he's not just rolling around. There's music coming out of there, right? And to try and argue that that doesn't have its roots in albums like Free Jazz and Ascension is bonkers. Hendrix knew those albums. That's what he's doing. When he stands up in 1969 at Woodstock and does the Star Spangled Banner, this is one of the high points culturally in rock history. You know, if we were making a documentary, we had 10 cultural high points in rock history, we would probably do Hendrix burning his guitar at Monterey, and we would probably have the Star Spangled Banner. Hendrix politically is making a statement there, but he's also musically making a statement. He's using free jazz principles to question the very nature of what the guitar sound is and what a guitar does. He's using the guitar as a synthesizer to create new sounds, right? So anybody who says, well, Hendrix was just blues, they don't get it, because Hendrix is the blues, but he's also a pop performer that writes songs and with lyrics, with great lyrics. They're great pop songs. He is a modal improviser. If you think of the way he plays on a track like Machine Gun, that's rooted really in a track like Love Supreme. And he's also a sound innovator that is exploring the outer limits of the instrument. If you put all that together, the pop artist, the blues guitarist, the modal jazz fusion improvisator, and the free jazz sound pioneer, and you put all that together, then you really start to understand Hendrix's unique input into music. And I say just music, period. Okay? What he does in the 60s, in that short amount of time, he emerges in 66, he's dead by 1970. What he does in that period of time is really reshape every aspect of popular music, rock music, jazz music, right? I don't want to talk about what he did for heavy metal, heavy rock. I don't want to talk about what he did for prog. I don't want to talk about what he did for guitar playing. I want to finish up by talking about what he did for jazz fusion, right? I think that the guitarists, it's not just the guitarists, all the musicians that were coming up in the 1960s, Cream, and to a much greater extent Hendrix, lays down the gauntlet, right? So in 69 and 1970, when the Band of Gypsys album comes out, you basically buy an album with a 10 minutes free improvised modal solo on it. Okay? Now, there are fusion musicians that are doing that, and they're doing that partially already because of the influence of Hendrix. But here we have a mainstream rock album doing it. Yeah, the Grateful Dead have done it to some extent. Jefferson Airplane have done it to some extent. There's other musicians doing it. But Hendrix is doing it brilliantly. That's the difference. Hendrix has created a language and a dialogue which is so important, right? Jazz guitarists that don't play like that are now redundant, really. They're archaic. They're straight away, they're in the previous time period. So musicians need to take that on board, and everybody wants that. That becomes one of the big bedrocks of fusion. So the bedrocks of fusion are jazz with rock beats, pop beats, funk beats, right? The jazz fusion musicians had to work out a way of making that expressive. Well, it's already been done in the Hendrix group. It's been done by Ginger Baker with Cream, but it's really been done by Mitch Mitchell. He's playing rock beats, but he's able to do that in an exploratory way. Hendrix shown how you can do that, right? The other bedrock is the use of keyboards and synthesizers. Well, I've just done a video on Jan Hammer. That's one of the things that's not happened yet. That's going to happen. But everybody wants that exploratory Hendrix guitar sound. I read an interview with John Abercrombie that said anybody with a distortion pedal and a wah-wah pedal in the early 70s was able to get a gig. That's what people wanted. And the jazz guys start to look to Hendrix and think, well, how do we integrate that into jazz or jazz fusion guitar playing? The guy that really does that is John McLaughlin, I think. If you listen to John McLaughlin's first album, Extrapolation, we have the summation that of everything that he'd learnt and done in London, but by 1969. But we don't have the overdriven guitar sound. We don't have the screaming notes, right? But John McLaughlin's been around that. He's been around that while he's been in London. This is a period of time which I find we need to know more about. I don't think John McLaughlin came across Hendrix while he was in London, but he did jam up with Hendrix once he got to New York, which is very interesting. But the fact is he did. And I think that influence is then heard on Devotion, which is almost like a Hendrix copy album. It's Alan Douglas, who was Hendrix producer, trying to find the next Hendrix, and he's plumped for John McLaughlin. It's very interesting. But everybody wants that sound. Everybody wants that. If Hendrix had survived, I'm sure he would have been guesting on every single jazz fusion album that was out on there. Instead, musicians had to look towards people like John McLaughlin, and then guys that have really got it nailed, like Tommy Bolin. And I think Billy Cobham's use of Tommy Bolin on Spectrum really redefines how you integrate that sound back into jazz fusion, and Bolin's guitar solo on Stratus is where it happens. Anyway, I've rabbited on long enough, I think, about Jimi Hendrix. I'm glad to finally have a video up here. It's be the first of many. But yeah, it all started for me with this. There it is. There's the man, Jimi. What a guy! The greatest rock star of them all, as far as I'm concerned. Right? In recent times, he seems to have. He seems to be not mentioned as much as, say, Queen or Led Zeppelin. These bands are, kids love these bands, but Hendrix seems to be diminishing as a talking point and as a reference point. We can't let that happen. He was the greatest of them all. We know that, don't we? Okay, I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.